First Edition is a ministry of First Community Church, a place of worship for everyone, regardless of religious background. Join us to enhance your spiritual journey and share in God's love and grace. And now, First Edition.
Good morning. Welcome to First Edition, the television ministry of First Community Church. My name is Glenn Miles. I'm the senior minister in this congregation, and I'm thrilled that you've joined us on this day to worship with us. I'm in the middle of my sermon series based on The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, the beautiful story originally written by L. Frank Baum over 100 years ago. It's titled Somewhere Over the Rainbow. Today's sermon is titled Lions and Tigers and Bears, Oh My. You've probably heard that before. Our focus is on the Cowardly Lion. And think of how we know the Cowardly Lion. We initially meet him as a bully, as a mean-spirited character in the show who attacks verbally the Tin Man, attacks verbally the Scarecrow, and he's quite mean. And then he even attacks Dorothy's little dog, Toto. But then we realize that behind that brutal behavior, that mean-spirited attitude, there's a frightened little lion, almost a frightened little boy. It's a beautiful story of how the lion emerges away from being a bully into becoming a courageous and gracious friend, willing to do anything for his friends who are in danger. The Apostle Paul wrote to a young preacher named Timothy, who was early in his ministry, and he said to him, "For God has not given us a spirit of cowardice, but one of power and of love." Do you see how that word applies to the cowardly lion? Do you see how it also applies to you and to me? It's a word that says we don't have to live as cowards. Oh, we might be afraid. It's okay to name our fear. But we've been given a spirit of power and of love. That's the point of this sermon. I look forward to sharing it with you. The Apostle Paul, or perhaps one of his disciples, sends a letter to his young friend Timothy, a pastor, a new pastor in a church, and he gives him this piece of advice. For God did not give us a spirit of cowardice, but one of power and love. An ancient psalmist writing 500 or 600 years before the time of Jesus reminds his congregation to be strong and let your heart take courage. Lao Tzu, the Chinese philosopher, writing at about the same time in the Tao Te Ching as the Hebrew poet, reminds his listeners that to be loved gives you strength. To deeply love another gives you courage. I rehearsed my sermon last night with my wife. When I got to this point, she said, "Oh, ad les mis." Do you know what line she's thinking of? To love another person is to see the face of God. These truths have resonated across the timeline of eternity since the beginning of time. They are reminders to us that indeed we have not been given a spirit of cowardice or of fear, but one of power and love, and that love leads us to courage. Let your heart take courage, the old Hebrew poet wrote. Let courage grow from your love. That is what indeed produces it. The Apostle Paul reminds his young friend Timothy that this faith that he has received, these gifts of faith and love and power and self-control came first from his mother and his grandmother. We sometimes take the Apostle Paul to task for the way he describes women in the church, but here he is very clear. These two women are church leaders. They are the ones who have mentored this young pastor, who taught him, who passed on the gift of faith. And we can no doubt assume the gifts of faith, of love and hope as well. I've watched the Wizard of Oz now about 9 or 10 times during the preparation of these sermons for this series. And it's clear that the most powerful people, like in Timothy's life, like his mother and grandmother, are the women in the story, most especially Dorothy, whose story we will look at next week. But this word has been given to humankind since the very first humans stepped up out of the primordial mud. You can almost hear across the winds of time, across the winds of eternity, the voice of God whispering in those first humans' ears, "You've not been given a spirit of cowardice, but one of power and of love." The Apostle Paul knew it. The old Hebrew poet, he knew it. Lao Tzu understood. Whoever it was wrote the words of that lyric from Les Mis understands the power of love to give us courage no matter what it is we face. Courage is never the absence of fear. Courage is moving forward even though fear compels us to stay behind. The Cowardly Lion knows this. The Cowardly Lion in The Wizard of Oz, I believe, demonstrates throughout the entire movie that despite his fear, despite him being understood as a coward, he truly does have courage. Time after time after time, when his friends are in trouble, especially when Dorothy is in trouble, he does whatever it takes. Oh, he's reluctant. He names his fear, but that's part of the power. He names his fear. But before we get to that, though, we need to own up to who he is when we first encounter him. He's somewhat of a bully. I just love the Cowardly Lion character. It shows the beauty and the power of the makeup that they were able to do. This was filmed in 1939. The Tin Man and the Scarecrow are amazing. The Cowardly Lion is far and away my favorite character, not just because of his makeup, but for the way he is. But it's a wonderful scene. And what happens here is we find that the Cowardly Lion is truly trying to cover his cowardice by his bullying behavior. He growls and he snarls and he barks. Y'all can take it off now, thanks. He growls and he barks and he snarls at people and he jumps at him and he says horrible, mean things to the Scarecrow and equally insulting things to the Tin Man. And then Dorothy's little dog Toto gets loose and tries to run away, and the big mean lion chases after that little dog. The lion's 10 times bigger than Toto, at least 10 times bigger, and yet Dorothy then all of a sudden, remember the most powerful character in the show is Dorothy. She steps up and confronts the lion, makes him stop. "Leave my dog alone. You ought to be ashamed of yourself," she says. Do you remember what he does? He starts to cry. He starts to cry and he acknowledges that his behavior is covering up his fear. He's afraid. He's a coward. He can't really be the king of the forest if he's going to be afraid and cowardly, can he? it really is a beautiful scene, and it sets us up for us experiencing throughout the rest of the movie the cowardly lion being the courageous one that he truly is. But before we get to that, let's pause on the idea of bullying. I read an article this week by Brene Brown in Psychology Today titled "The Cruelty Crisis." She says that there's a crisis in America of bullying, and you can see it especially by the way reality television tries to lure in its audience. What happens in reality television? We see people at their worst, bullying each other, being mean to each other, putting each other down, putting them in their place, making fun of them, making them feel terrible. For Brene Brown in her research, this is a sign of our culture and what's at work. She said it's not just happening at school. It's not just a bullying problem at school, it's a bullying problem in our culture. And she says the root of it is gossip. Uh-oh. Gossip is the root of our bullying. She illustrates it like this. She says sometimes parents would see that there's an awkward little first grade boy who never gets invited to the birthday parties. And yet those same ones who wonder, why is it, those parents who wonder, why is it he's not being invited to the parties? Then in their little PTO clique, they talk about how weird his mother is, never considering that they would invite her for coffee or a glass of wine at the end of the day. The bullying starts in gossip, and she makes it clear. Sometimes it's in the backyard over the fence with your neighbor. Sometimes it's over the water cooler. Sometimes it's in the carpool line. And sometimes, in her words, it's in church parking lots. Sometimes that's where it begins. She says that what often happens, this isn't true for everyone who is a bully in school, but oftentimes what the kids are doing at school is mirroring and mimicking the behavior they've seen at home. Maybe they've even been bullied by a sibling or a parent. Now that doesn't excuse the behavior, but it helps us understand even more, so doesn't it? She asks rhetorically in her article, are you willing to be the adult that your children need, whether you have children in your home or children in your office or children in your field of influence? Are you willing to be the adult that children need? Because too many children see adults behaving like bad children. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying all this and recounting this research that she's done to make you feel guilty. I'm not saying that at all. Guilt is only helpful if it works as a bridge. If the guilt helps you see the bad behavior that needs to be left behind, then guilt becomes a bridge to walk and follow on your way toward a new behavior. Metaphorically speaking, you're walking towards a new behavior. You're leaving behind the old behavior and you're leaving the guilt. Because guilt does us no good to be carried around. If it opens our mind and opens our eyes to see something that needs to be changed, fine, then leave it behind. I've seen people metaphorically and even in reality almost bent down by their guilt, unable to stand up and move forward. There's even a word for sin in the Old Testament. It's the Hebrew word awon that literally means to be bent down by guilt. Jesus said to his disciples, "My burden is light." What he means by that is leave the guilt behind, follow me on a pathway to a new way of life in the name of love. You see, the cowardly lion is filled with fear. He's overwhelmed by his behavior and the things that he just can't seem to let go of. But he's vulnerable enough. This is the beauty of the story. He's vulnerable enough to name his fear, to acknowledge that he's afraid, and still move forward to care for those he loves. Someone once said, I think it was 15 or 20 years ago, that the Bible has 365 references, like one for every day of the year, where it says, do not be afraid, or fear not, or don't be filled with fear. 365 times it says that. It's almost like a daily calendar, those little tear off things, and it's the same thing every single day. Don't be afraid. I did some research once, about 15 years ago or so, maybe it was 10, I had a concordance. Do anybody know what a concordance is? It's a book that records every single word in the Bible. Yes, I'm nerdy enough to have bought one. It was like $75. It was crazy. This is before we had Googler machines, you know. And so I decided to do some research. I went through all these different words, and I got kind of lost in over hundreds and hundreds of verses, which kind of proved the point. I never did get an accurate count. But all the way through the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, we hear that instruction: do not be afraid. Abraham is called. He's named Abram when he's first called. He's called to be the founder of a great nation. After that calling, he does some really dumb things. Like one of them is, he basically says his wife is not his wife, and he hands her over to Pharaoh. This is a huge mistake, trust me. He's challenged by God on this. And then later in Genesis 15, God says to Abraham, do not be afraid. It was fear that allowed him to let go of his wife, not to protect her. Don't be afraid, Abram. Don't let fear guide you. The angel to Mary, on the day that she finds out she will be bringing the Son of God, the child of God, into the world, she will be the Theotokos, the God-bearer. What does the angel say to her? Do not be afraid, Mary. The angel 9 months later to the shepherds tending their flocks in the hillside appears before them. Do not be afraid, for behold, I bring you good news of great joy. Jesus then grows up and over and over and over again says to his disciples, do not be afraid, do not be afraid, do not be afraid. I would suggest that you write those words on your bathroom mirror. Put them perhaps on the door of your refrigerator. Write them on the doorposts outside your front door so that in your coming and your going, you're reminded every single day as you leave, as you return, every single day of that simple instruction: do not be afraid. I'll fast forward in the movie. We're getting toward the end now. The scene shows the lion in the middle, the Tin Man, and the Scarecrow on either side. They're hiding behind a crop of rocks. They can see right below them the Wicked Witch's castle. And down below them are the Odio guards. Do you know who I'm talking about? I've heard from people that you know, I mentioned early in the sermon series that my brother was scared not only as a child, but all the way through his adult life of the flying monkeys. And many of you said, oh yeah, me too. And then last week I heard some people say, you know, the monkeys never got to me, but boy, the Wicked Witch of the West, I was always afraid of her and that crystal ball or whatever it was, where she could look and see where her enemies were going, where they were moving around. And then still others said to me later this week, you know what really scares me are those guards, those Odio guards. And they even chanted to me to make sure I understand. Remember the chant? Odio, oh, oh. Help me, choir, come on. Odio, oh, oh. Hey, I could join the choir. But you look at them, they do look pretty frightening, and they've got these scary outfits on, these soldiers' uniforms, and they're carrying gigantic, huge spears, and they're marching in perfect military formation. Oh, and it's overwhelmingly frightening. Except, do you know what they're called? Anybody know what they're called? The Winkies. How could we be afraid of the Winkies? Well, the Scarecrow says to the lion, I've got a plan, and you're going to lead us. And the lion responds, I'm going to? It's me? The Scarecrow's, that's right. Scarecrow's clear, that's right. It's you. And the lion, you watch the scene, it's too long to show. You watch the scene and his face transforms. You can kind of see his shoulders coming back. And there's a look of resolve in his face. And he says, oh, right, because of Dorothy I'll go. Wicked witch or no wicked witch? Guards or no guards? I'll tear him apart. And he growls, I'll just tear him apart. If I don't come out alive, that doesn't matter. But can you do one thing for me, you guys? He says to his two friends, talk me out of it. I love that scene so much because it is the lion being exactly who we are. He names the fear. He admits it. We can't take on these guards. We can't take on this witch in her castle. How in the world are we going to do it? And what is it that compels him to go forward? It's his love for Dorothy. It's his love that gives him courage. It's the same love that Lao Tzu knew, that Hebrew poet knew, that the Apostle Paul understood, that Jesus taught his disciples and us, that we sing about in Les Mis. To love another person is to see the face of God. And that love, that knowledge, that vision gives us courage. Here's the thing, though. If you don't practice it, it will start to fade. If you don't use love in your family, in your office, your school, your church, it'll be like trimming a rose and not putting it in water, but just leaving it on the sidewalk. Eventually, like that rose, it will wither and fade and be taken away by the wind. The challenge to all of us is whether or not we're willing to put that love into practice, to name the fear, to speak it out loud to those that we trust, those who care for us, and then give that love away, no matter what. That's the simple and courageous call to all of us. Amen.
Come, Christians, join to sing, Hallelujah, Amen. Loud praise to Christ our King, Hallelujah, Amen. Let all with heart and voice before his throne rejoice. Praise is his gracious choice. Hallelujah, Amen.
So my friends, on this day, leave this sacred space knowing that God's Spirit guides us and gives us strength for everything that we encounter. We walk not alone, but we walk with faith, hope, and love. The great gifts, and the greatest is love. Amen.